Hey Alex, in order to use a sequencer to render your films or movies, first thing you'll need is a movie render queue, and you can do that by going to Edit, Plugins, and just enable movie render queue right here. And I also recommend taking the take recorder, but I'm assuming you already have it, so enable take recorder and you will get this take recorder scene. This is obviously just to record your sequence, which I have already done. This is my sequence. As you can see here, I'm not actually recording the component itself or the long exposure actor itself. I'm just recording the actors or the subjects of the film, which is going to be the mannequin for me. Once the recording has been done, you can come to your sequence like I've done here, scene 1, and I've unlocked the sequence and then just drag in the long exposure actor. So take in that actor and just drag it into the scene. I've already done it here, so we can see a long exposure actor in the sequence itself. For that you need to unlock it and then just drag it in here. Once that is done, you have to make an important change. Just come back to your long exposure actor, your default or the component BP long exposure camera, and then go to the camera, which I can't open by the way. So here the component, so come to the long exposure component, so BP long exposure camera component. Here, instead of using the space bar to trigger the start capture, by default it will be like this, right? I think it'll be something like this, using the space bar to start and stop the capture. But now when we are starting to render the film itself, when we're moving into the offline rendering using sequencer, we'll actually just cut this off and bring the start capture to the begin play event. So just connect it here. So when the scene starts rendering, the start capture will be automatically called. Once that's done, you can compile, hit save, and then come to the sequencer. In the sequencer, go to the render and come to the settings. Here you'll need to add a couple of things. First is the command line encoder. If you're using command line encoder, you can obviously add it, but I do recommend using command line encoder because it allows you to render an MP4. And the next important thing is the UI renderer, both of which you can add by going to the plus setting and then you'll get the option. So if I delete my UI renderer, come to my settings, and then at the bottom you will see a UI renderer. Add it, and then in the output you can set whatever you want. I'm simply going to override the frame rate. Remember, the higher the frame rate, the smoother the long exposure is going to be. So I'm going to set it to 60 fps, keeping in mind that my sequence is also at 60 fps. It must be overridden, yeah, right here. So it's the sequence is at 60 fps and the render queue is also going to be at 60 fps. So UI renderer and then command line encoder if you're using it. Once that is done, you can just accept and click render. Now you will see we are looking to the perspective of the long exposure camera, and then we'll start the exposure pretty much. I'm going to wait for this to complete and I will show you the final result. So the rendering is complete, but I don't know why it hasn't compiled it into a video. I think it's because we are using 5.0 for this example. Yeah, in 5.2 it should automatically compile it into a video, but you can see the frames here. We have the exposure going on, so the long exposure does work. I don't really know why it did not compile it into a video. Another issue might be the size of the widget itself. So you can see the background character, and on top of that we have the final overlay of the long exposure. In order to fix that, you can come back to your demo or your project file, sorry. And in the widget, so go back to your plugins and then search for long exposure, and you'll see something called WBP underscore LE result. Open that up, and here in the canvas panel, or the image, I think it's the image, you can come back and increase the scale to 2. So do that. So this essentially will fill the entire screen. So increase that to 2 and compile. And then once you render again, the widget will sort of cover the entire screen rather than being in the center and a small square. So hope this helps. I'll try to compile the video and post it on the Discord as well. I think it's a it's a version problem, because I did render using 5.2 when I was testing for the release, and it did work fine. But as you can see, at least the frames are working. The frames are indeed rendering. So this is a frame from the start, or I'll just rather show you the start. So we're starting somewhere over here. So you can see the character moves slightly, a little bit of exposure, and then we come all the way down. We have a lot of exposure. Another thing I might point at is the actual motion blur settings. Come back to your long exposure component, and then here search for motion blur and try playing around with the max and target FPS. The lower the FPS, the more dramatic the motion blur is, and less smoother it feels, but it fills the trails more quicker, so to speak, right? You need less game FPS in order to get that full trail effect, whereas higher FPS are much more smoother and realistic, but it takes higher frame rates to fill that trail, right? Max is pretty much the upper limit of the blur. You can crank it up all the way to 50, but in my opinion, I did not notice any considerable changes. So with that said, hope this helps. If you have any questions, do let me know. I will post the fully rendered video as well.